Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Lloyd Erickson. I'm the managing editor for Biographical, published Natalie's great book. I'm not going to say much. I just want to say one of the best things that happen as an editor is when you get a manuscript and you read it, and as you're reading it, you're just nodding your head saying, yes, 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 this is what someone needs to write. And the second best thing is when I get that manuscript, I read it, and I realize, oh, I have to do a lot of editing on it. And so Natalie provided both of those with this wonderful book, After Happiness, and we'll leave the discussion here.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Greer Bates Cordner. I'm an associate editor for Wayfair magazine, and I had the privilege of reviewing Natalie's book for Wayfair. The review is forthcoming, but spoiler alert, I really liked it. But we're really grateful to be here. We're grateful for Greg Coford Books and all the work that they've done helping to organize this, and to the Compass Gallery for hosting us today in this really beautiful venue. So I just want to give a quick lay of the land of how this is going to go today, and then we can dive right in to the main event. So the first thing is I'll give a quick bio introduction of our guest of honor, Natalie, the author of After Happiness. And then after that, she's going to present material from her book, ideas about the writing of her book. She's just going to give us a brief presentation of her book. Afterwards, I'll ask the first icebreaker question for a Q&A session. So please, while you're listening to Natalie present, please be thinking about things you'd like to hear more about, things that you're really interested in, maybe about the behind the scenes of bringing this book to life. And then hopefully we can have some lively discussion for the remaining part of our time together. So without further ado, Natalie Brown is a lifelong Latter-day Saint, currently based in Boulder, Colorado. She holds a BA from the University of Chicago, a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law, and a PhD from Columbia University in English and Comparative Literature. She explains why she has an embarrassing number of degrees in the book. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the whole story. And then hint, the academic job market is not great. She has been a guest columnist for the Salt Lake Tribune for several years, and you can also find her writing at Wayfair and by common consent. She is also interested in LDS literature and is the editor of a critical edition of Susa Young Gates's John Stevens's Courtship, A Story of the Echo Canyon War, by Common Consent Press, 2024. She and her husband, Michael Schertz, are the happy parents of two boys, one of whose music we got to enjoy before here.
Yes, the musician is Anderson, and I am prouder of him than I am of this book. So it was the best surprise in my life that my son can play music like that. It is so moving to me to see so many friends who have been with me from childhood, through my teenage years, through my early days at the blogger Nickel, and I might cry a few times during this presentation because it just touches my heart. So I grew up in Michigan, and I have some members of my Word of Michigan here today. And it was a happy place and an unusually optimistic time in America. It was the 1990s, the Cold War had ended, the government was debating how to spend its surplus, and historians were talking about the end of history. So it was just a bizarre baseline in which I truly believed we were going to change the world for better. Although now that I think about it, I don't know what I would have changed because we had it pretty good. But as in all fairy tales, the happy childhood vanished and learning and growth had to occur. So when I was a senior in high school, my dad developed a degenerative back disease, and he had to stop his practice as an orthodontist. And around this time, I went to receive my patriarchal blessing. And the patriarch was Richard Tripp, for those of you who know who that is. And we went up to his apartment, and I know he gave me the spiel on patriarchal blessings, and then he put his hands on my head for a very long time. And I started getting worried that he had nothing to say. And finally, he said, someone else in the room needs a blessing first. And he gave my father a second patriarchal blessing. And there were two messages in that blessing. One I remembered, and the other my mom reminded me of later, much later in my life. But the one I remembered at the time was that he said a major, maybe it was even the major purpose of my dad's life, was for his children to see how he handled this trial. And I did not understand at that time what it meant to lose your income and your health and your profession all at once and just have no idea where, what you're going to do next or how you're going to provide for 3 children. All I felt in that blessing was God's overwhelming love for him and for me. But I shoved that into my mind, just like, oh, isn't this great that dad has had to go through something hard, and I am heading off to University of Chicago, and life is all potential. And it was a really great 4 years for me. But I have been thinking about my dad and this blessing quite a bit over the last few years because things have not gone according to plan. My father is dead. I'm not the professor I wanted to be. And the optimism that I felt about our future has given way to grief and mourning for the actual future that we picked. We have lived through, as I started listing this out, it's pretty shocking, like September 11th, the Great Recession, the collapse of the humanities job market. Now I could add the collapse of the academic science market, the COVID-19 pandemic. My own kids have lived through wildfires, 1,000 houses burned in the 2 cities next to us, and we watched it from our deck. Mass shootings in our local grocery store, and the political turmoil and polarization that characterizes our moment. And when we read the Book of Mormon today, I find it a little too easy to liken it to ourselves. At church, we are experiencing many changes as well. So we moved from 3 hours to 2. We have seemed to be changing our stance on things like women in the home that until recently felt to me like doctrine. Garment designs have changed. Many members no longer adhere to the word of wisdom. We saw many members reject the counsel to be vaccinated. In my area of Colorado, there are very few families with children left in our ward. Today, the statistics say the majority of adult members are single, and the ideals in the family proclamation are often financially out of reach. The most shocking realization of my adult life after going through the 1990s Young Women's Program, in which I felt gender roles were being presented a little bit too restrictively, is that I am now one of the only mothers with children at home currently in my ward. I could not have imagined that. For those of us who like to write and podcast, the LDS media sphere has fragmented into an unprecedented number of competing voices and platforms. And I think we are struggling to say which messages and practices are core to our faith, and which may not be applicable anymore in a global church. Many of these changes, I think, have been good and necessary. I think we did need to swing towards a bit more individualization and a bit more claiming of our own authority and flexibility, but they have also challenged my identity of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint and left me longing for community, particularly as my own children are attending church without many other peers. So I believe we are facing a crisis that is perhaps less about truth claims than about the collapse of the economic, social, and political structures on which our modern church was built. And like many of you, I find this moment bewildering because I had failed to process that the institutions that were so core to my heart and my identity could fail. I genuinely believed that we were headed towards a great future. And so the question that my father's life and these social changes that we're living through have presented to me is, how do we live with faith and with joy in a moment in which our old formulas have stopped working, and in which I think many of us feel that things will probably get worse before they get better. My father knew his health was going to decline. There is no happy ending to that story. And yet, what impresses me is that he lived with joy and he built community, and he chose to provide our family with a future that was optimistic even though he would not have wanted the future to go that way. And as I sat during COVID rereading the Book of Mormon by myself when we were not attending church in person, I began to see the scriptures anew too. And most prophets lived in unhappy times. And I think we might even say that most scripture sprang from eras of disruption. And for people of my generation who grew up in this abnormally happy baseline, once I think we recognize that instability and mourning are the norms and that prosperity and stability have been the historical exceptions, we have a chance to build something more resilient. And so the argument of my book is that the church overly emphasized individual formulas for happiness during my childhood in the 1980s and 1990s that were very particular to post-war American culture. And I think we are now struggling to respond to an historical moment in which these formulas are out of reach. And that we have questions about what it means to live the gospel and to build communities in our current context. However, the hopeful lining of this otherwise depressing story is that I think the loss of our prosperity and our cultural expectations is also an opportunity to forge a more resilient gospel and reclaim other values like mourning, unhappiness, and endurance that have the ability to transform us. And if you had my slides working, you would now see a picture of the memorial to the Brontes in Westminster Chapel that I stumbled upon while writing this book. And it says, their memorial says, "with courage to endure." And I just thought that was such a striking example of how they were not pursuing self-fulfillment or agency, but endurance was a value that they took seriously. And it made me wonder what other values I had lost. So happiness in the Latter-day Saint tradition has, of course, sort of always been in the tradition. In the Book of Mormon, Nephi says that his people lived after the manner of happiness, and Alma talks about the fall and the atonement as the great plan of happiness. But happiness has not always meant the same thing. Legal scholar Jeffrey Rosen, and to be, I don't know, bipartisan, who I actually learned about through Spencer Cox, has discussed how the founding fathers would have understood the phrase happiness in the Declaration of Independence as something more like virtue than good feeling. So that when they are writing that declaration, they are saying that we need certain qualities of a just society in order to live a virtuous life. But over the last few decades, happiness, I think, in our common culture has been associated more with wellness, with personal desire, and with feeling good. I think it's very reasonable to presume that Joseph Smith, who is, immersed in these traditions as well, probably had something more like virtue in mind when he was translating happiness in the Book of Mormon. So not only has the meaning been changing throughout our society, but the church has not always equally emphasized happiness. And now if I have my slides, you would see a graph of how references to happiness in general conference talks start ticking up in the 1990s. References to joy start ticking up in this period too. But what was interesting to me, and I wish I had said more about in the book, is I couldn't really discern how happiness and joy were being used differently in this text. Some texts would actually just use them interchangeably. So we have a lot of ways in which, to quote Michael Austin's review of my book, I think happiness has been laden with more meanings than the term can actually bear. And this is even more obvious when you look at references to the plan of salvation versus the plan of happiness in conference talks. And I'm gonna hope that you can. So references to the plan of salvation have been, they're pretty consistent throughout our history. And I would really love to show you just this one graph, and I know most of you will not be able to see it, but basically, this is the references to the plan of happiness in general conference talks, and as you can see, there are none until maybe like 1970, 1980, and then it starts skyrocketing up to the point that it actually, I might be wrong about this, but I think it displaces references to the plan of salvation. And I got this information from Patrick Mason, who said, the plan of happiness appeared in only one general conference talk from the 1850s through the 1960s. And then there were 1 to 2 mentions of the phrase in the 1970s, 12 in the 1980s, and then an astonishing 85 in the 1990s, 125 in the 2000s, and 132 in the 2010s. So it goes from not being a phrase that was really in circulation in our culture to like being the phrase that we have been hearing about. What's interesting is that happiness is not frequently found in LDS scripture either. Emily Updegraff observed there's only 26 references to happiness in LDS scripture, and they're all from the Book of Mormon. Joy is the term that is used more frequently in our scriptures. So what is going on? So my hypothesis is that as the church integrated with the American economy, and as we were increasingly asked to build Zion in our families, homes, and hearts rather than an actual place, that happiness provided a crossover secular lens that was more individualistic, adaptable, and portable. And it mirrored the wellness rhetoric and focus on personal desire that was becoming pervasive in America. But I think the consequence of this is that as happiness became more associated with individual traits and actions, we also became more detached from our communities. And I believe we have lost some of our abilities to have ethical conversations about when it might be appropriate to sacrifice some of what we want for a greater purpose or a common good. So today at church, our focus has shifted towards covenants. But we are struggling, I think, to articulate what it means to act upon these covenants or to live ethically in our community and our broader society. So I'm just going to read a few, like a random sampling of quotes about happiness in general conference talks, and you can just listen to it. I'll keep this part short. It says, this is from 1986. We are restored to a state of happiness when we have chosen to live according to the plan of happiness. 2002, each of us has observed how some individuals go through life consistently doing the right things. They seem happy, even enthusiastic about life. We all search for happiness and we all try to find our own happily ever after. The truth is, God knows how to get there. He has created a map for you. He knows the way. And then one from 2023, isn't it simple to be happy? Just make covenants and keep them in your lives. Let us review some of the things that can help us stay on the covenant path and make us happy. Okay, so these are just random messages that were offered in conference, but I think they do showcase a persistent pattern, which is happiness may be framed as something achieved on earth, as a state in the hereafter, or frequently as something only vaguely defined. But again and again, happiness is scripted as the result of making the right choices and following the right path. So I think that this framing has had some good consequences, but also some ones that have not been as productive in our culture. And the first one I want to talk about is I think happiness became evidence of our truth. And this is, what I mean by this is that our feeling happy became evidence of the truthfulness of the gospel as well of our personal righteousness. So to give an example, I'd often hear missionary stories in which the people would say, oh, but why are you so happy? And then the answer would always be the gospel. More recently, I remember during periods of my life in which I was a stay-at-home mom, I would be pained when I heard other mothers feeling that they were being pressured to defend their choice to become mothers through the rhetoric, well, this is what makes me happy, or this is my choice. Like, it was not acceptable to just be a mother. It had to be like happy. And I am very happy being a mother to Anderson because he's brilliant. So just to be very clear about that, he is the greatest. So another thing that you start seeing throughout the conference talks is that there's a lot of anxiety about how well we follow the formulas. So there'll be talks about, well, you have to consistently be doing the right thing, because if you slip up once, then it's all over. And now we do believe in the atonement in this church, but listening to this talk might give you a different idea of where this is all headed. And I think along with that, we start seeing a lot of anxiety. And depending on our point of view, we can be anxiously engaged in a good cause, or we can have OCD, and we see both perspectives being discussed in our culture today. So talks, as I was mentioning, they rarely define happiness. It functions, I think, rhetorically less as an emotion we experience than as a promise reached at the end of the correct path. But people hearing this language repeatedly might logically expect that they should feel happy when following the gospel teachings. And so I think this leads to sometimes confusion or can create a crisis because wrong choices can feel quite happy and right choices can feel unhappy. So we get a lot of talks that attempt to distinguish true happiness from counterfeit emotions that are then called fun. But it raised a lot of questions, because what do we make of saints who are living the prescribed formulas but don't feel happy? And from the unhappy housewife to the LGBTQ Latter-day Saint, we start to get margins of Mormonism that are filled with members whose desires have failed to align with the prescribed path and whose actual experiences within the church and the gospel feel less than happy. I think another thing we start to see is that people who feel unhappy start to be sometimes stigmatized as having done something wrong, which means that people might be stigmatized if they're depressed, neurodivergent, or critical of the church in any way. Probably the most frequent comment I hear about my Tribune articles is that I am too negative. People do not engage with the argument. They dismiss me as negative because, and I think that is very informative, that there is this much pressure to project positivity in our church. And finally, I think the one that personally bothers me the most at this moment in history is that we start to develop a pressure to perform lifestyles that carry the cultural signifiers of happiness. So looking a certain way, having certain things, adhering to particular aesthetics and lifestyle preferences become signifiers of one's worthiness, success, and belonging in the church. I think today's influencers are the logical extension of this culture, in which Utah curls and Instagrammable mansions now define Mormonism to the majority of my non-member friends. So I talk later in the book how I think a lot of this pressure to perform happiness could be dated to at least back to the polygamy era. And Michael Austin, who's in the audience today, helped me edit a novel by Brigham Young's daughter, Susan Young Gates, John Stevens' Courtship. And what I found so fascinating about this novel is her first edition of the novel has many, many references to polygamy. The second, which occurs several years after the manifesto, has all those references erased. And I think we can find, so I would like to exercise some generosity towards us as a people and say that I think part of the reason we have a lot of this pressure to perform happiness is that we did actually have significant persecution in the pioneer days and in the days of the early saints. And I think it is useful to look at that history to think about how these tendencies developed within our culture. But today's talk is going to focus more on the present. So General Conference discourses propose a lot of formulas for finding happiness. These are just a few of the things that church leaders have told us we can do to be happy. We can serve a noble cause, create something beautiful, exercise compassion, do the small things, pray, repent, follow the 10 Commandments, know that we are sons and daughters of God, have more gratitude, be selfless, make covenants, have happy homes and happy children, exercise more patience, and smile more. And so some of these are a little bit amusing, but I do think we see that in the 1990s, the one that becomes the most significant is to follow the model of the family prescribed in the Family Proclamation. And I'm just going to read a quote by Elder Richard G. Scott, which I think exemplifies this. He says, "For the greatest happiness and productivity in life, both husband and wife are needed. Their efforts interlock and are complementary. Each has individual traits that best fit the role the Lord has defined for happiness as a man or woman. When used as the Lord intends, these capacities allow a married couple to think, act, and rejoice as one, to face challenges together and overcome them as one, and to grow in love and understanding through temple ordinances to be bound together eternally." That is the plan. So you literally end saying that is the plan. Like this is the plan, and that is the plan that makes us happy. So unlike earlier moments in church history in which leaders like Brigham Young emphasized more communal forms of happiness and experimented with specific economic innovations like the United Order, these are rather individualistic formulas that typically frame the path to happiness in ways that have little direct relationship to communal well-being. The largest unit we're really dealing with is the family, potentially the extended family. Okay. So what? So here's the problem, and I think why we have now a happiness crisis. So in 2026, many of these formulas have cracked. Our country is changing, the church is globalizing, members are frequently talking past each other, and it's a little unclear to me what is holding us together, other than the fact that we are all very unhappy with the current state of affairs. So what do we do, and what comes next? So I am going to probably offend the religious scholars in the room through my pronunciation of the scholar's name. But the late religious scholar Walter Brueggemann talks about how the Israelites' liberation from Egypt begins when they begin voicing their complaints to the Lord. And he says that real criticism begins in the capacity to grieve because that is the most visceral announcement that things are not right. Grief, he writes, can permit a new reality, theological and social, to emerge. So this book does not offer a formula for happiness. In fact, it should be clear that I think formulas are part of the problem. But I think we can find a great deal of comfort in the fact that many of our most significant developments in our faith tradition occurred when the collapse of a previous model forced people to expand their theology and understanding of the Lord. And as we move beyond happiness, we can recover and discover other ways of understanding and living the gospel. And that is what the last 3 chapters are about. I talk about how our baptismal covenant is to mourn with those who mourn and comfort those who stand in need of comfort. It is not to be very, very happy. It is to love, to take up our cross and follow Christ and endure to the end. Christ does not promise us happiness. He promises us peace in this world when we follow him. But when we are so focused on performing happiness that we cannot even acknowledge the unhappiness that people in our own pews might feel, then we cannot mourn with those or mourn and embark on a process of transforming ourselves and expanding our faith. And I'm going to skip through a little bit of the middle chapters and talk about my favorite chapter, which is chapter 4, in which I'm going to argue that Nephi provides a model of how to live with faith in a time of crisis when our world has collapsed. And so the Book of Mormon, as Grant Hardy and Charles Gibbons and some other scholars have all observed, begins with the religious and political collapse of Jerusalem. This is a much bigger collapse than the one occurring around us today. And when Nephi leaves Jerusalem, the first thing he's asked to do is to send his sons back for the breastplates. I think it's significant that the new society needs to be rooted not in Jerusalem's culture, but in scriptural narratives and the everyday work of loving each other and staying alive. And I'm following that impulse to find answers to our own crisis by returning to the scriptures, particularly the Book of Mormon, and reading what they actually say. And so I have a lot to say in my book about Nephi as a model of living in faith, but I think it's actually useful to start with a counterexample, which is Laman and Lemuel, because they are the ones who are focused on personal happiness in the Book of Mormon. And I'm just going to give you a quote from when they are asked to help assist building the ship, and they tell Nephi, like, no way, we have been suffering, we've had enough. And they said, behold, these many years we have suffered in the wilderness, which time we might have enjoyed our possessions and the land of our inheritance, yea, and we might have been happy. And that is the most damning complaint that they can lobby at Nephi, that, well, they would have been happy had they just stayed in Jerusalem. So I'm actually a little bit sympathetic to Laman and Lemuel. And the reason why, though, is different than the reason why I was as a child who just found Nephi kind of to be annoying. And that they are, I think, actually trying to live the religion of their youth that they inherited. They were taught that Jerusalem was the land of their inheritance. They attended, their faith community's traditions. And I believe, reading these texts again, that they simply do not believe and cannot believe that Jerusalem will be destroyed. Because that was God's covenant with his people, and they believe that. They want to return home to a religion and country that they do not believe can fail. It is undoubtedly true that they are not happy, that life in the wilderness is pretty miserable. And their complaints, and really, frankly, the defense of their wives, they say, like, are giving birth in the wilderness, are very justified if you actually believe Jerusalem is the land of your inheritance and that this is your faith. So I think since we are accustomed to viewing Laman and Lemuel as doubting villains and told endlessly that we should be steadfast and immovable in our faith, we can miss how their error lies in refusing to let their faith evolve and in accepting that their civilization can collapse. Nephi takes a different approach, and he accepts that his society has failed. He not only accepts that Jerusalem can fail, but he then has a vision that shows him that the entire Nephite civilization that he's going to be building in the promised land will also ultimately fail, and that his descendants are going to be killed by Laman and Lemuel's descendants. He is filled with unimaginable grief. And he writes about this grief and his anger throughout the text. But his response is humbling, I think, and instructive. After he sees this apocalyptic vision, he returns to find Laman and Lemuel arguing about the meaning of his father's prophecies. And even though he is without any hope for his long-term future, he patiently explains the Lord's teachings to his brothers anyway. He keeps going and he keeps loving. And I think we see throughout this text that he starts turning back to his own father's example and to the example of the prophets before him, as he realizes that this is in many ways the prophetic task, to keep going, to keep loving, and to keep building relationships, even when things seem or might in fact be rather hopeless. He not only does that, but he also begins to innovate a new theology that incorporates Christ and expands his understanding of the promised land and of the covenant with Israel. So like Laman and Lemuel, I think we have a choice. We are in an unhappy time, and we can look towards the past with excessive nostalgia that prevents us from moving forward, or we can allow ourselves to embark on a mourning process that accurately sees where we are, but that ultimately transforms us and might allow something better to emerge. I do not have a lot of confidence that we're going to get a better country after the events that we are currently living through. But I do believe that we can be better in our hearts and build better relationships and better communities in our own spheres of influence. Like Nephi, I would like us to allow ourselves to be led by the Spirit, not knowing beforehand the things that we should do. Because I have so many of my father's friends in the audience, I'm going to close actually by reading a passage at the end of my Nephi chapter. During COVID, I was reading the Book of Mormon over and over again and just shaking my head about how we were warned about all of this in very literal, plain language. And I had become excessively angry with people who did not share my perspectives on some of the topics occurring today. And I told my mom, I remember sitting in my basement, and I told my mom, I don't know if I can go back to church. And this is where I'm going to start. It says, she tells me a story. After my dad became disabled, our family needed to assess our resources. An insurance company that he was relying on was contesting his claim. He needed to sell his practice as he could no longer treat patients. Despite his best efforts, the sale fell through, leaving our family in financial instability. His anger was tearing him apart. But in his heart was an instruction that he received at my patriarchal blessing, And this was the instruction that I had forgotten until this moment. The patriarch said that the Lord was mindful of his situation and that he should not let bitterness in. Remembering that Joseph Smith once wrote a conciliatory letter to William W. Phelps to repair their relationship, he decided to do the same. Dad wrote a letter to those involved in the sale, acknowledging what he had lost, but expressing the hope that they would meet in the future as friends. He sold our home to fund our educations, and he built a new legacy as a teacher, mentor, and always friend. William W. Phelps went on to give the eulogy for Joseph and Hiram Smith and to write the lyrics of the hymn, Praise to the Man. Said, only at this crossroads in my own world do I understand how much cause for bitterness my father had. He could have remained angry about the unfairness of his situation, but he chose instead to provide my family with a future. From this moment, my anger is gone. Zion has fled, and the only place I can rebuild it is where I already am. I returned to church a few weeks later. I am loved and feel loved. I am even happy. I am heartbroken when my ward is eventually reorganized because these are my friends. And if, I sitting here with all my friends, the message I would like to leave is the power of our relationships to touch each other and to turn away our hearts from anger and polarization. And I am so grateful for all of you today who have supported me, some of you since childhood, others throughout my writing career, and some of you just as strangers I just met today. And I almost feel like I should bear my testimony at the end of this, but I'm going to let you see my testimony in the epilogue, which is perhaps even better than chapter 4. All right, thank you.
So I'll go ahead and ask the first question. Please keep in mind the questions that you all have too. One of my favorite lines, I don't remember if this was a quote from someone else or if this was you, in chapter 4 is as you're setting up this really great exploration of Nephi and all of the things that he was processing when he would have been writing this in middle age. I love your description of the middle age.
And that comes from Grant Hardy. Grant Hardy was the first person who brought to my attention that the narrator, Nephi of the Book of Mormon, is not the useful figure of art, but a senior citizen, I think is how Peggy Fletcher Stack or someone put it a few days ago. So,
but I love that you say that tragedy is the normal state of affairs in the Book of Mormon. And as I was reading your book, I kept thinking about things like Alma the Elder with everything going on after the collapse of King Noah, Limhi and his people after the collapse of King Noah. They both had kind of different but similar experiences. The anti-Nephi Lehi is experiencing almost entire wipeout. And then finally, right at the very end, especially with Mormon and Moroni, witnessing the end of their entire civilization. I was kind of curious why in chapter 4 you chose Nephi specifically, what it was about his experience that you felt was especially pertinent to
that's
yours.
a really great question. I allude to some of the other episodes, but I do not study them with quite the depth that I do Nephi. I think for me, it's because I really identify with Nephi at this moment. I think he is very much kind of like us millennials who are maybe bridge figures who remember what things used to be like, and we know that we're going to have a different future. And since there's a lot of academics in this audience, one of the things I find particularly intriguing about Nephi is he has a line in which he basically says he's not going to pass on to his children his knowledge that he learned in Jerusalem. And so I think in a moment in which many of us are very afraid that our children will not have the education that we have or will not have the opportunities that we have, it's interesting to see someone who has been through a similar experience decide that, in fact, a lot of it wasn't worth passing on and that there was opportunity in this crisis as well. So, yes, I think it's just because I really identify with Nephi and like him. And, and he's I think, he's the last person in the Book of Mormon to remember the before, to have been educated in Jerusalem. No one else will have that memory.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and we'll start here.
I was very struck by your discussion and what you quoted from Patrick Mason about the plan of salvation becoming the plan of happiness. And I don't want to make too much of that, but I
Yeah.
also want to make sure we make enough of the fact
Yeah.
that that actually takes the entire gospel from a post-mortem reward structure
Yeah.
to a now reward
For sure.
structure.
Yeah.
And do you think that actually, that shift has accompanied the name change, or is this just a rebranding?
That's an interesting question. I thought you were going to say that it kind of removes Christ from the narrative too. But yeah, future to present. Yeah. And that is a big move. And I have to say that I actually kind of like the idea that we should be building Zion in the now. I went to a Catholic school, and one of my favorite songs talks about like, here in this place, a new light is streaming. And it basically talks about the idea is that heaven is here on earth and not far away. And so to the extent that it does that, I actually kind of like that. Yeah. No, that's really interesting, because happiness, I think, is achievable. Well, good feeling at least is achievable now. I don't want to, part of the problem is what is happiness, but whatever that shift does, I do like the idea that we should be striving to build Zion in the now and not waiting for heaven. But yeah, I'm going to have to think more about that. Yep.
I had the opportunity this afternoon to do a little bit of a line edit on Greer's review of your book for Wayfair, which should come out in the next week or so.
Excellent. I'm excited.
And Greer said it in a couple of places that, no book can cover everything, but here are two things that I wanted to know a little bit more about.
Yeah.
So I'm actually going to turn my question to Greer and say,
yeah.
are there
And let's
either
see
of
if I
those
have an
things
answer.
that you want to ask her to amplify on?
Yeah.
I think probably one of the main ones. So I am a historian of American religion.
Yeah.
And so my brain goes into
Yeah.
like other aspects of American Christianity. I could not stop thinking about Norman Vincent Peale.
I'm
I
sorry?
was reading about Norman Vincent Peale. He was he started out as a Methodist minister. He became more I can't remember what denomination he ended up in, but he started out as a minister, but then he really made a name for himself as kind of like one of the earliest self-help gurus that we have.
Yeah, interesting.
And his big best-selling book was The Power of Positive Thinking.
Yes.
Which was branding biblically based ideas about happiness and how that should like transform your life and make you happy and successful and give you all of your wildest dreams, kind of like proto The Secret, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of curious. I did see that church leaders have quoted Norman Vincent Peale in general conference talks. And other things.
That's fascinating. So I will say I'm not that familiar with him, and I would love to go study this now. I see some follow-ups,
I guess what I'm curious about is, in all of the digging that you've done, have you seen any trends of things that were going on outside of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that you think might have also been seeping in to the influence?
Yeah, and I really like Ben Park's book on, I think it's American Zion, that talks about sort of the history of other religious movements and their emphasis on the family around the same time we start emphasizing the family. And he talks about how, the church basically did PR studies finding that the family is a good message in this moment. And I think you see that in many other religious faiths as well. And then basically what I would say is I think our economy developed in a way in which these traits like positive thinking and being invested in your career became very important. And we were no longer all based in Utah. We no longer had communitarianism. And so I think as we were forced, I don't know how to say forced, as we, for whatever reasons, are now living dispersed amidst a society that values those traits in the workforce, I think very much that rhetoric, and I don't want to say it's necessarily bad, but I think people are trying to make sense of their reality using, they're trying to bridge their religion and the reality of their lives. And so I think that does create a tendency to talk about religion in a way that parallels the capitalist values and economic values of the workplace, because that's what we're doing for most of our time. And I don't know, this is not necessarily entirely bad either. It also has consequences. So,
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, yes.
I had the chance to read the book early on, and I've heard you talk recently about, in the conversations that have come to place after, about things that you wish you had put in the book that you
Yeah.
didn't. And I'm wondering what some of those insights might be.
Yeah.
What else
Yeah.
have you been thinking about since it was?
Well, yeah, the two things, well, there's three things I wish I'd included more of in the book. One is actually more of the Old Testament stories. I tend to be very influenced in my writing by what's currently on my mind, and I have loved teaching the Old Testament stories in primary this year. I particularly liked, and here the Old Testament scholars might cringe at my pronunciation, but I particularly like the Josiah story, in which we have this 8-year-old who becomes king, and he's like, well, I guess we should repair the temple that's been sold off. And they find a book, and like, oh, what's this? And it's the commandments. And I love how he goes to the prophetess, and she tells him, and basically it's like, well, your society's getting what's coming to it, but you are going to be spared a little bit of this, and you are going to have some peace. And I love what a lot of these stories have to say about how we can keep going and access the Lord's peace even when things are quite bad. So I wish I'd included more of those. I could see like an entire follow-up book just like analyzing different scripture stories that are all on this theme. I might just create a website about, I don't know, other examples. I wish I talked more about joy and how it may or may not have been framed as different from happiness, because there are, I think, still more references to joy than happiness overall. And I didn't talk about it at the time because I couldn't discern a difference between how joy and happiness was being used in the talks I read. But I think that is in and of itself meaningful. And I wish I had done more of that and gone back through like the history of these words. So maybe that's another follow-up project. And along with that, I wish I had talked more about this idea of how the founding fathers thought about happiness, because I think there's a lot of interest right now about this in the church. In fact, I actually heard, was it Christopherson, or when they did the video about the Constitution, I think they actually made this very point. And so I wish I had said more. Had I known that they would be, the book I think was already impressed at that time, but had I known that this would be like raised in all of our Sunday schools, I would have talked more about that, because I think it's a really significant thing. And I think in this moment, we're all thinking about the Constitution. I think thinking about what were the values that we had and what did this actually mean would be a very useful exercise. So yeah, I'm sure I'll come up with more things I wish I had said and added to this list later.
So I wanted to say two things. One is how much I like what you're saying, and then a question. Haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it. But from the couple of presentations I've been witnessed, I really like what you're saying. And one thing that I think is important is I think it's pretty clear that you're not saying that we should choose to be unhappy, but it's just that we need to deal with reality. And in fact, I feel like what you're saying is maybe how a better way, a truer way of truly finding joy.
Yeah.
But here's my question. You talked a little bit about individual self-focus, self-fulfillment versus community. And I'm wondering if you could say more about how we can do more to strengthen, rebuild communities and the benefits that will come from that.
Okay, so I'm going to take first your comment and then your question, because I want to talk about both. So remind me if I get on the first track about the community question. I do somewhat develop, I think, a definition of joy in this book as it goes along. And it's one that I find, again, grounded in Nephi. And he comes up with the idea of tender mercies. And we talk about that all the time, but I think it's really significant. Is he's not saying we're always going to be feeling happy. For me, I experience those emotions as somewhat independent of anything I'm doing at a particular rate. I mean, I just kind of am happy, or I am a little anxious, or I am a little depressed, and it's not necessarily correlated with anything I'm doing. But I love that term because I think it acknowledges that things are hard, but that there are these tender mercies, and that the Lord is with us, and that there are also these moments of grace in our life. And then he also talks about how he's experienced God's love is so strong that I think he describes this as like burning his flesh. And that's the kind of joy I'm hoping to experience and that I'm holding out for. And then to the community point, yeah, so a lot of this book, I think, did originate out of my grief at the fact that I do not have nearly as strong of a community as the one I grew up with. And I think that is a real loss. I think when I started writing for the Tribune, I started proposing a number of ideas. I was like, oh, we can make the chapels into community centers. We could rethink tithing so that, I don't know, people don't have to choose between sending their child to preschool and paying tithing. We could, what were some of the, I don't know. Anyways, there were ideas. But what I wanted to go with this is I increasingly believe that these solutions have to be local. Because I think what we're seeing is that, there are some areas, like in my area, maybe more like the exurbs, that are actually overflowing with members and they don't have enough capacity in their buildings. And then there are other wards like mine that have a very declining population and are struggling to even staff things. So what I would like to see is us have more ability to locally innovate the community programming aspects. I think we do need some structure and some plans. I don't think ministering has been all that successful because I think it's resulted in people not just doing nothing. But, in some areas where there's like a critical mass, it might make a lot of sense to have the Word buildings double as community centers, and you could sponsor events there. People could form little preschool groups in there. It might be that in other areas, we need different solutions. So like my mom's stake in the Avenues in Salt Lake also has very few children. So they have moved all the children and youth in their stake into one ward. And so I guess, I don't know what I call it, the child ward or the family ward has become, I guess, what the singles ward used to be. And then the rest of the thing is for like people who don't have children at home or like so. And I actually heard great reviews of that model from many people when I was up in Salt Lake last week. So I think I said on the Tribune podcast, I think that I would like to see an attitude that if something is not prohibited by the handbook, that we can innovate as much as we feel like. I think we have a culture, at least in some words, not in all words, but in many, in which we feel that we can't do anything that is not expressly part of the program. And I guess I would like to see that flipped, because I don't think we can have a community that meets people's needs unless the people on the ground feel ownership of that community and are able to innovate the solutions that will work in their area. I think this is a particularly challenging question in like the global context. I know Margaret and Bruce have been very involved in the church in Africa. And what is going to meet a community's needs is going to look very different in different areas, and even within the United States. So yeah.
I have always been a little bothered by the idea of enduring to the end.
Yeah.
And I just decided that I couldn't ever use that. I didn't want the word endure.
Yeah.
I'd rather have the word joy.
Yeah.
Live by joy.
Yeah.
And joy to me seemed more connected to people and community than this enduring to the end. I know you mentioned that as you first started.
Well, I think it's partly because when I saw that on their epitaph, I was startled by it. It's not rhetoric we hear anymore. And yet in other periods, you hear a lot more about like salvation, endurance. And I think about the fact, the Brontes had a horrible life. I think Charlotte Bronte died at around, was it like 38? By the time she died, she had outlived all of her siblings, and they had all died of health problems. They were facing being kicked out of their parsonage when their father died. People did not live long, and children were dying all the time, and it was really hard. And I think when I processed the reality of what that meant to people in that time, then I can understand why they might have focused on a word like endurance, because it probably took a lot of courage to get up every day and persevere while everyone is dying, and you haven't found someone to marry unless she does it the very end, and you might not have housing, and her prospects were basically being a governess or teaching school, and she could never earn enough money to have like a house of her own. She tried to set up a school at one point with her sisters, but it never quite worked. And so I guess when I try to get back into that mindset about like, well, why were they choosing those words? I can, even if I don't want to endure to the end, because I don't want to live like that. I think value how hard that was for them and just the act of courage that would have taken. So I think I went from being like very jarred by that language to just sort of thinking about, why am I jarred by it? Why am I so uncomfortable acknowledging the fact that most of history has been very difficult? Yeah. So and that people might have needed to like affirm that.
I think we have time for one more question, so we'll go ahead and pass this to you.
This is more of a comment. We're talking a lot about joy and happiness as synonyms. And yet, scripturally, they're not at all. Joy and rejoicing is almost every single time it's used in the Old Testament in the context of having received a forgiveness of sin. That once you've been to the temple and received forgiveness, you may then go and rejoice. And you invite all your friends and you rejoice. Those who live after God's law are blessed by that. And that's the word translated as happy. So the Beatitudes, happy are they who, whatever.
It's
and
more
so
of like a blessing tied to.
There's a very big difference in receiving forgiveness, mercy, chesed.
That's super interesting.
The satisfaction and peace you have in life when you live what you believe.
I wish I had included that in my book. So yes,
Put it on your blog.
Look at my blog. Yes, and this is where I wish, like, I do wish I had a little bit more knowledge of like the older. I was just telling Greer, I really would like to see people create a reading list of all of these like key books that we should read about the scriptures and the theological tradition outside of Mormonism.
Well, I think one of the benefits of a book like this, though, is it's going to reach an audience of people who also may not have had access to like formal theological training or anything like that, and who are going to start having these conversations that are so necessary. And so thank you for
thank you.
for
And
doing
that's
that.
what I'm hoping will happen. Is I've toyed with the idea of creating a website for all the follow-up comments, and it was really important to me to write this book as a memoir and not as straight up scholarship. One, because there's just realities to being someone who doesn't have an academic position and has wonderful children at home, but I just don't have time to do some of that archival research. That's very expensive scholarship to do. But also because I really think that it's our relationships and our community building that are so necessary right now. And I think memoir and literature has a way to touch us emotionally in ways that maybe scholarship and just straight scholarship does not. And so that I think is why I wanted to make it hybrid, so that we could see each other and feel a little bit more moved by each other's experiences. So
I think that just about wraps up all of our time, but thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
everyone,
I know.
If you haven't already, there are still a few copies of the book left, so if you haven't grabbed one, please come do so. And also, hopefully, we can keep having these conversations. There's some refreshments in the back. And thank you all again for coming, and congratulations.
Thank you. And now I'm going to say also like my one promotional spiel. I have realized that it is very important to review books on Amazon and Goodreads. So if you are not my family or super close friends, it would be very useful to have more perspectives there. And I learned that you can buy a book elsewhere and still review it on Amazon. You just will not be a verified customer. So Okay. Thank you all. This is just such a pleasure to have you all here.